Hey guys, thank you so much for sticking through. I heard a lot of really great lessons coming out of this morning, and we're going to really try to keep things going. No pressure here, but we have a lot of really great folks with me, and I think that just I'll do some very quick intros and then let you guys kind of take it from there. I had to write myself notes because there's a lot here to go through. But Lindsay is Global VP of Comms at Casper. And has previously come from the publishing world, Oxford University Press, Time Out New York, among others. Marco Greenberg, President of Thunder11, down to the end, has built out GSK and the Ohio State University, and very important, and helped out now established brands like Akamai and WeWork getting to where they are today. And Joe Cohen, Chief Comms Officer at Axis Capital now, and previously SVP of Comms at Kind Snacks, of which I've already consumed 2 today, so thank you for that. And just to kind of get things, to kick things off, tell us something I have omitted from your bios.
I haven't taken a nap today, so very off-brand, but I plan to after this.
Very nice.
Part of my bio? Not really.
My first job was as a radio jock at an R&B station in Syracuse, New York.
Whoa.
According to Harold Burson, I'm one of 3 other people on planet Earth that worked at Burson Marsteller not once, twice, but 3 times. So either shame on me or shame on them. I don't know which.
A multiple boomerang, impressive.
Yeah.
So just to kind of kick things off, because I know we've got a lot to cover, and we're really here talking about brand building. So just from an overall 360 view, how do you build a brand? What do you feel is one of the keys from a communication standpoint? And then we'll drill down from there.
I guess as the senior guy, the oldest guy in the room, I think in a way, and we talked about this in our preparatory call, that there's a little bit of a PR paradox here, because on one hand, PR is the tip of the spear, I think at least, and I think some of you do when it comes to branding. On the other hand, we feel a little bit sometimes like we have a chip on our shoulder, inferiority complex, a little like Rodney Dangerfield, if anyone remembers that actor, Back to School. Like, who are we to sit at the table with some of the leading people in the branding world? But if you really look at establishing the brand and promoting the brand, and as we saw earlier, defending the brand, PR plays a critical role, but not always acknowledged, and I guess that would be my point.
Yeah, I think, wow, Rodney Dangerfield, that took it way back. With building a brand, I think that it begins with business strategy and really understanding deeply the business goals, business strategy, and larger objectives of the organization. And then as far as the narrative and storytelling element of that, I think that it's marrying the business realities along with what's the essence of the brand, what's the soul of the brand, and how can you bring that to life from a, again, from a, it's overused now, but from a storytelling perspective. And then I think that once you're able to really nail down the narrative, have it tie back to the business objectives, then there's all sorts of different ways that you could bring it to life. I think to the point that Marco made, what's interesting now is that, especially if you go back 20 years ago, PR suffered from kind of sitting either not at the table, so to speak, or sitting at the very far end of the table. And I think now in an environment where, as I think everyone knows, and it's very, very, very well documented, the lines have blurred, there's an opportunity for communications professionals to have much more impact in driving the brand building process. So it's a really exciting time to work in PR.
Yeah, likewise. We can't use the word story enough, and I think that the brand is really the umbrella to which you feel it appropriate to tell those stories. And who knows the brand more than the PR person? A brand manager may feel like they know how to define that umbrella, but nobody like a PR person knows how to go out, tell those stories and see if they resonate. And I think it's a constant feedback loop. If PR isn't at the table, then the brand can't adjust. The brand continues to surge along saying, these are the stories we're telling, good luck with that. And a great PR person knows how to bring the effects of those stories, whether they hit or whether they fail, back to the business, so that way the brand can develop and strengthen as it grows.
Absolutely.
And it's not only an actual seat at the table, and hopefully a CMO and a CEO that get the importance of PR, but it's also sometimes taking issue with terminology in our industry of, hey, the creatives are in advertising, right? I don't know about you guys, but I think there are a lot of creatives in PR. I think we're also creatives. And it's not just talking about it, it's delivering it. I taught a class in marketing a couple years ago at NYU, and we had a former client come in from Akamai Technologies. Big success story on the web. They deliver 1/3 of all content on the internet, and it would be more if they did adult films. So, I mean, that's a lot of content, and the best branding exercise they do all year was delivered by the communications folks, and it is the State of the Internet report Akamai does every year. So that's an example of, hey, branding and PR really go together.
Yeah, building on something that Marco just said, I would argue that there may be more creative opportunities in the PR field right now than there are in a traditional advertising firm. In many advertising firms, particularly the big ones, you have a very segmented role where you're either the person who's the account person, or you're in the creative department where there's a lot of creative room, or you could be in media planning or strategy. But if you want to look for a profession that's also a creative outlet, I think that in PR there's a lot of opportunity. And a few years ago I might have said, particularly in the brand and consumer marketing part of the industry, but now with social media having forced more brands to play more aggressively in the branding space, you're seeing brands within the financial sector and other categories really beef up their branding.
And I was going to say, I think that when we're talking about that, playing nicely between PR and advertising and other disciplines, I think Casper is actually a really good example of that. So how would you say that's been, how has PR fueled Casper's growth so far? No pressure.
Oh, yeah, no pressure. PR has been a crucial part to Casper's success. We really look at marketing as a closely collaborative spectrum where we have creatives at the table, advertising at the table, PR at the table, social media at the table. An idea can come from anywhere. It can come from the PR side, it can come from the advertising side. What's most important is if that idea works on different layers, right? So the most impactful marketing strategies, because at the end of the day, PR is just one great arrow in a marketing quiver of weapons. I'm conflating my weapons. I always do this. We really strongly feel that the best campaigns layer on PR on top of something else that tells the story, that resonates with customers on an individual level, and that also works on social media. So having everybody at the table and collaborating is the most important thing. Now, I know a lot of people don't have the privilege to get to that place where you're at the table, and I think it's really about managing up and making sure that your voice is heard.
Yeah, I mean, I agree in general, and by the way, your brand is outstanding.
Yeah,
I'll
absolutely.
take all the credit for it.
You should. But as we talked about on our intro call, when a company is young, when they're in the startup phase, it's often the PR person, comms, that's leading the charge on the branding front. I don't know how many of you have been involved in naming exercises for products or companies. It's incredibly time-consuming. It's difficult. It's subjective, et cetera, but it's an important role that PR people can assume before there's the bureaucracy, before there's the silos. I also think I've been challenged often by CEOs to look at their About Us section and say, what works, what doesn't? Throw some darts at this. And I think we're uniquely qualified to really analyze the words, right? I'm not gonna say that we're not insensitive to design, but words matter, and words have consequences. And I think within the organization, the PR people are usually the best qualified for that. But I think if we had someone from JWT here or Landor Associates, they disagree. but that's my perspective.
Well, I think also it's very important from one industry to another. I mean, your About Us section is going to look very different depending on the industry. And I know, you've had the benefits show of working with the very different industries, one after another pretty much, right? So do you feel that finance versus, actually edibles, do they look at PR differently, and do you find that it's any less important to finance from a brand storytelling standpoint?
That's a great question. I think a lot's changed in recent years. I mean, when I had began my career, it was on the agency side, and I spent 15 years at the PR agency MWW, and I loved working on the agency side, and I loved working at MWW because you got a chance to peek behind the curtain and learn a lot about many different types of industries. And something that I think is very different now than it had been in the very late 90s, early 2000s, is that there's much more of a desire in areas like corporate finance and in sectors B2B as much as or increasingly, there's more of a focus on the importance of earned media and building a brand. Whereas that was kind of like almost like a nice to have as far as having a very strong communications department, as far as elevating your presence in the media, or at least really investing in brand development, unless you had a portion of your business that was very, that had a strong consumer function. So I think that there's a lot more parity than there had been, and that there's what I've seen is a significant uptick in the amount of activity in sectors outside of the traditional consumer areas. I think that what's happened as far as sophistication, when you look at tech, when you look at, I think, food CPG, there you have some teams, agencies, practitioners who are incredible at communications. There's also many of other sectors, but those ones in particular jump out at me. Granted, I'm biased because I worked in some of them. I think that what you're seeing now is you're seeing other sectors that are looking to take best practices and reapply them in a different context. And that's part of the kind which I had been at. Great company, again, very proud to be a part of that team. The CEO, Daniel Lubetsky, remains a tremendous friend and mentor to me. I saw an opportunity when I moved to Access Capital because within the insurance space, which falls within the financial sector, there's this increased opportunity to brand. And I think that in the industry, whereas not that long ago, if you began to head down a certain path, you may have become a tech person or a food person or become very specialized. Now that you're starting to see more brands play in that space, it creates opportunity for you to really broaden your experience. And if you have a company with a great story to tell, a great culture, and a great environment, then that's the building blocks that you need regardless of category. And clearly I felt that way about Axis, and that's why I was excited to make that jump from snacking to insurance.
When you're talking about Daniel at Kind, how many of you eat Kind bars or have eaten Kind bars? Right. So a little bit of ancient history, but it was either 1998 or 99, and Daniel came to my office. This was just when he was starting out, or even before he was starting out. So articulate, so idealistic, so passionate and driven. And I guess what I'm getting at is, and maybe we can have a little friendly disagreement here, that the founder and the brand, if the founder is still around and the brand, I at least like to play that up if I can. And I think maybe that's a PR perspective, a comms perspective, but I often get in situations, and maybe you all do too, where how much do we put the CEO out in front? The starting this tech company in a garage, the scientist or doctor that gets big in pharma. And I don't know, I've at least in my career seen different perspectives, but I've also seen a lot of tension around it. And I err on the backstory, and I think that's another example of us PR people. We own the backstory. We own the genesis. What do you think?
Yeah, Casper has 5 co-founders.
Wow.
And so what could be complicated has become a blessing because the light isn't on one particular person at all times. But if it was, I think there's always a balance a PR person has to make between making that quick decision to get that PR hit and thinking long-term about the brand. And that's really, to me, what defines a good PR person who's going to get that story in the New York Times, and the great PR person who puts the brand first and knows that if you are building a long-term big brand, you know when to say no. You know when the hit about the CEO, which you know the CEO is going to love, you know it's going to be great this month, is not going to move the brand forward next year. And that's the real difference. So if you have a figurehead who's going to, again, be a part of that business long term and push the brand forward, shine the light on them. If it's not going to build the brand, then you're better off focusing your efforts elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, a great topic, and wow, 5 CEOs. I think
Five co-founders, yeah,
co-founders.
one CEO.
Who's
great if he's listening. He's great.
I think that it depends on who the founder is, who you're working with. And you could think of the quintessential examples of brands that effectively leveraged their founders, but the brands endured after the founders passed, like Steve Jobs from Apple and Dave Thomas from Wendy's. I think what those brands did effectively is they leveraged their CEOs as incredible assets, as incredible brand ambassadors, but the success and longevity and endurance of the brand wasn't contingent on those individuals. I think sometimes, though, you also have to think about the brand image that you're conveying and whether or not your CEO is the best ambassador. And if you have a founder who is someone of that ilk and someone who really just represents the brand in a powerful way, Daniel certainly was and is an example of that, then yeah, I think absolutely leverage that person as appropriate to the point that Lindsay was making.
Yeah, no, so I was actually going to ask you guys, because I think a lot of it comes down to the personal brand and building that versus, a corporate brand. And, I'm wondering what you guys think, that it's very important to figure out what are the types of stories that you want consumers to be telling about your brand. And sometimes it might be something about the founder. Sometimes it might be a greater story about the reason for your brand's existence. And I'm wondering, how do you guys convince your audiences in order to share those types of stories to basically keep the conversation where you want it to be?
That's a great question. So at Casper, the communications team is a little bit bigger than just PR. We also have social media, editorial, content, brand partnerships, and we get a lot of feedback. So when I talked about the feedback loop earlier, I mean it. I mean, if something is resonating with PR, then does it resonate on social? Just because you get a hit on a blog, just because we're on TechCrunch, doesn't mean that article is shared by an audience. So it's interesting to think about not only the story you're telling and what resonates with a media person, but is that story then resonating after it's printed with an audience? Are they sharing it? And more so, I always say press builds press, right? So if we get a story out there, are other reporters picking up on it? Are they interested in telling that story?
I think I agree with all those points. I think that also it begins with what's the business objective? What's the outcome that you're looking to achieve? If it is if it's driving trial, driving sales, driving awareness, differentiating your brand in a certain area, that's going to impact the messaging that you tell. So it could be anything from driving, promoting a brand as being something that's very client service driven. It could be trying to promote a certain type of product. Something that we learned at Kind was that people cared more about the health and taste of the products than they did about the social mission. And media inherently was more interested in the social media missions. That was always something we had to reconcile. I think that when you go into the financial services sector, part of the challenge is how do you make it something that is very interesting and appealing to media, particularly mainstream media, but at the same time advances your business objectives. And right now, something that we've seen that are hot topics within insurance are there's emerging areas of risk, such as cyber and climate change and pandemics. And right now, those are emerging. They're not yet a core part of the, they're not as big a part of the business as some of the more traditional areas, but they're growing and they could open the door to showcase some of the other areas. So I think it's a combination of pragmatically what will help you secure coverage, get you in the door, but also how can you generate exposure, conversation, positive attention that will help advance your bottom line objectives.
Great point, Joe. I think we also have to acknowledge that we're frequently in a precarious position as PR practitioners, meaning by definition, there's high risk and high reward. This is not like sitting with the CMO and talking about a mailer. With all due respect to mailers, I happen to like mailers, but that's not what we do, right? Our stuff is much more mission critical, and there's room for error, and you don't have to be Jeff Jarvis at CCNY to know we're gonna lose some control here. And that's part of what's gonna give us the credibility that we need. So, you know, when I'm thinking about that, I'm seeing CEOs like Elon Musk at Tesla or Howard Schultz at Starbucks. These are individuals, to their credit, that embrace risk and get it out there. I mean, a lot of people talk about POV, but you guys probably, if you're in-house or agencies or consultants, you know when push comes to shove, they're gonna choose vanilla in 90% of the cases. And maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I'm too, you know, jaundiced by the whole thing, but that's the frustration. So getting someone that can push the envelope, and then you're right, Joe, link it back to business goals, not just say thought leadership, and we're being strategic, two of the most overused words out there, but they still have resonance. And I think kudos to Casper for many reasons, but I want to specifically say, and I don't want to embarrass you on this, but there's a posting on your online site about sleeping habits of individuals who practice a polygamous lifestyle. Now that is POV.
I didn't write that.
I'm glad you clarified. But that, whoever did, credit to them for having the courage to be out there, right? That's out there, that's shareable. And there is a demographic for that. And even most of us who are not, let's face it, there's a kind of a voyeuristic curiosity. How does that work? And you guys tap into that, which is wonderful.
Yeah, well, you bring up a great word, which is control. And the umbrella of your brand should help determine the control you have over the storytelling. So if you have a well-defined brand, then you have the freedom to go out with a lot of different stories. I think the less defined brands have a harder time taking the risk because they haven't identified what those risks for the brand are.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one thing that, and we haven't even said this word, but we're all kind of like talking around it, the idea of targeting. And I think that there was a time where you thought of a brand and it had to have 100% the same message all the time. And now, I mean, do you guys feel that you can have different messages as long as you know who you are and it all ties back to the greater whole?
You can have different messages and different messages that you accent with different audiences, but at the end of the day, everything needs to live naturally side by side because it's very easy for, you know, for example, you may be targeting both moms and their kids, and I think that you would, one of my clients back in my agency days was Ballpark Franks, and we wanted to target teenage guys and we wanted to target their moms. As you may expect, we had very different messages and very different mediums that we worked with to reach those audiences. At the same time, we didn't want there to be an authenticity gap if moms happened to see what the teen guys were reading and vice versa. So it's tricky, but you want something that will, even if you're having different methods, there won't be a dissonance. So I think that another point that you made, though, that's a very good one, is one of the amazing aspects of this media environment is there's so many different outlets and so many different ways to hyper-target your core audiences. One of the challenges is that you don't have those big opportunities that you used to have not that long ago to generate impact. Like you go back not that long ago to the Oprah Winfrey Show, if you got a hit on Oprah, you knew you were seeing a business lift, or you're pretty sure that you were going to. Now it's a lot harder, and it winds up being shooting a lot of bullets rather than heaving cannonballs and trying to see a big result.
But I think this is why PR has to work closely with advertising. It's not
sure.
just about the creative, it's about amplifying the story that PR can land.
Yeah, I agree.
You know, the other thing I think there is another bit of an elephant in the room in terms of, as I like to say, all you know, PR people should be publicists or should have a familiarity and a skill set in publicity, but not all publicists are PR people. In other words, the ability to sit with a CEO before he or she gets on CNBC and train them, not just from a technique point of view, folks, of bridging and flagging and mirroring and crossing my legs or not, but really content driven, right? What are those push button responses? What are those key messages? When a PR practitioner works with a Fortune 500 CEO on the crisis du jour, that requires a level of sophistication and expertise and business understanding that not everyone realizes good PR people have. So I think back to what I was saying about the paradox thing, sometimes we cut ourselves short and don't give ourselves enough credit to jump in and say, you know, we also write well, right? We know how to wordsmith. We get the difference between positioning in the big sense of things and then messaging. But we also know what we don't do, right? So we might come up with a great idea, a beverage that I love that I drank over the weekend, largely because of my son, which was harmless coconut water. Have you guys anyone know this brand, Harmless? Yep. How did he see it? On HBO Silicon Valley. It's product placement. It's all over the place. And to your point about making an impact today, I mean, you know, like a lot of you, we've had stories on the front page of the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, photos, et cetera. It's not like the old days. The old folks are saying, your phone must be ringing off the hook. That's an old expression, right? It does. I mean, it's maybe your cell phone is vibrating with text, but it takes a lot to move the needle, and you gotta, you know, have a lot of bullets in your holster chamber. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think
More
that
weapons.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I think the more I hear you guys talk about this, the more I'm kind of reminded about the fact that there's so much more media landscape that you've got to compete with nowadays, that in some ways, I wonder if you think that PR is more important or less important. And obviously, we're a biased audience, but does it become a less important audience branding and building technique as your brand goes out there and as there's actually like a product that's out there in the marketplace?
When I went back to Burson Marsteller the second time, I was told we cannot, this was 97. I was told that we cannot refer to what we do as public relations. We do perception management. Well, do you know how journalists reacted to that? They said we engage in deception management. So it is what it is. I think back to a dichotomy here is, on one hand, if we articulated what we, hi Yale, if we articulated what we did sometimes in a more compelling way, I think we'd get the respect that we deserve. Unfortunately, I will go out and say, A, I think we're more important than people realize in the branding process, but B, I think a lot of people see what we do as a commodity business, smiling and dialing. I heard a client say that to me last night. Like, forget this, forget that. Just work, smile and dial. Come on. We need some hits. We need some hits. And yeah, that's important. That's important. But if we're only defined by that, then something's off.
Yeah. I think Marco made a lot of really good points. I believe that PR and communications is now more important than it perhaps has ever been. And I believe that there's still, and people believe that, but there's still rampant misperceptions about the value that we bring. Part of the reason why I believe that PR's role has increased, and there's also an increase in perceived value, even given the misunderstanding, is that we're in a hypercharged media environment. I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody here that that news travels in an instant. Reputation of venerable brands could be, blemished and tarnished in minutes, if not seconds. I mean, Samsung was a great example that was shared earlier by Sandra, and within that, brands tend to, and also there's right now what you have that you didn't have that long ago is social media has created a dynamic where consumers have a much bigger voice. than they had before. So there's, I believe, more of a need and an understanding that there's a tremendous amount of value that communications brings. As far as looking at communications as strategists on communications pros, as strategists on the same level as advertisers, as senior level marketing executives, and really just at that strategic level, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. I think that when, to a point that we were talking about earlier, having that opportunity to have a seat at the table, now more and more we're getting that opportunity. So when you're at the table, being able to maximize that opportunity is essential. And I see Joe Trunkale from PRSA in the back. He's the CEO. Something that PRSA has done a really good job of in recent years is helping to educate their members on how to take advantage of those opportunities. Because, you know, if you squander that opportunity, then you reaffirm the belief that we're smiling dialers. And I also want to give a lot of credit to people like Al Chen and Megan Leinberger, who really did a great job of building a conference that reflects the role and opportunity that communications pros have today. I think that's been a theme throughout this.
So, and amen to that. I think that talking about the seat at the table, you know, so obviously we were talking a little bit about the integration with every other department that a brand has at its disposal, but I'm wondering for other people who are having a harder time fighting for that seat at the table, you know, you've done such a good job at doing that, you know, what are some of the ways to best advocate for the role of PR in the brand building process?
Yeah, I think there are two reasons why PR hasn't had a seat at the table. One is, I think, and this is legacy, I think it was a traditional female role. I think I see a lot of women here, and we know that it's a very female role that didn't have a seat at that, sorry gentlemen, at the boardroom table with the men. And that's why we see creative directors, we see ad agencies who are getting called out for not having women high up in the accounts. And I know there's a lot of women here who probably feel like PR was shut out because there's a lot of men at the table. So I think younger companies are absolutely changing that, and that older companies are taking, whether it's been handed to them by their clients or not, they're taking strides to make that change. Another reason is measurement. PR is so difficult to measure. Communications, branding, whenever I see measurement from an agency that's, you know, amount of impressions, we know it's garbage. We know that impressions are just complete BS. Whenever I get a press hit, it says this received 2.3 million impressions. We know that's a lie. We have no control over, we have no control over where an article gets placed on the website. We have no idea how many people are reading it or getting to the bottom of the article or sharing it. And until we as an industry can agree that impressions are garbage and that we're looking at brand sentiment, share of voice, and more important factors about longevity of the brand, we're doing ourselves a short-term disservice. So my advice for people who are trying to get to the table is to acknowledge that the measurement right now is probably not fitting in with how corporate is viewing the measurement of PR, and to really try to find a way in to make the impact be seen, because it is impactful, it is important, and it really depends on every different company, every different brand, and find allies throughout the company who understand the importance of storytelling and getting the message that other people want to tell out to the right people, to the right audience, and to new customers.
Just to have some fun. Agreed with everything you said, but we have these panels sometimes. Oh, I agree, great point. I'll disagree with one thing.
I didn't write the polygamy article. We've talked about this.
I feel funny sitting
I
in the
want to
middle.
meet the person who did, actually. No, just kidding. Impressions are garbage, quote unquote. I think there's certainly inflation, but I take issue with you on that point. Let me give you an example. Jeremy mentioned we work with the Ohio State University, the Wexner Medical Center, and there was a story of a lifetime that I worked on last spring. It was based on a paper in Nature, scientific magazine, and it was about an implant that our client from Ohio State, a surgeon, neurosurgeon, put in the brain of a 24-year-old quadriplegic that allowed him to move his hands in complex movements for the first time. Now, Ohio State, according to their calculation, said it was 8 billion impressions. And I'm thinking to myself, are there even 8 billion people on planet Earth? I mean, this is like huge. But when you looked at the cascade of the media everywhere, for them it was about proportion. So they could say, of all the stories we've been involved in, other than on the sports front, we've never gotten this much buzz. So I agree that there's inflation there, and I agree that it's exaggerated.
But getting buzz and saying that many billions of impressions, I mean, you're admitting it's not an accurate form of measurement.
I'm admitting that. No, I think it's inflated, but I think when you look at it from a contextual point of view, it's also making a statement. But there's a larger point here, which is, who are they trying to reach? Anyone have an idea who the Wexner Medical Center is trying to reach? Who's their major audience? What? Other hospitals is one. Right? What about philanthropists that want to support science? So when they can go in and say, hey, this is what appeared in Mashable, this is what appeared in BuzzFeed, here's an article with a segment with Miles O'Brien on PBS NewsHour. So even though some of the overall measurements might be inflated, they're inflated across the board. But it's really about how can those results drive more results for the business.
But what you're saying, though, is they got the right places, it was the right story, and it was in front of the right eyeballs.
Yes.
So I'm agreeing with you because what my point is, the word impression in that sense is meaningless, and it wasn't the right way to measure, because what you're really measuring is quality of the story, audience, all of those different factors.
But I don't think.
And I think PR people, though, when you're setting yourself up for expectations with the client, to measure yourself against those goals, even if it's as vague as, is this story, like, what percentage of our talking points did it hit? I think PR people are going to do a better job measuring themselves and proving themselves internally than just saying we have 7,000 impressions, and it's not going to make an impact.
It has to be
business.
one of several different criteria.
I think I can tell Joe's burning with
Joe,
getting
go.
in here.
No, I wanna chime in too. I think one, it's just nice to see that you have communications pros so fired up over measurement that it's become.
Hey, but look, it's like baseball players talking about RBIs and home runs. You know, it's sensitive stuff.
No, but I think there's some good points made across the board. My take on it is that, one, I think that there's a lot. I agree with the initial point that Lindsay made, that there's a lot of room for improvement when it comes to how we measure. I do think as an industry, we're beginning to make some significant strides. If you haven't seen it and you're looking for ways to measure, the Barcelona Principles, which was put out by a group of research executives, I think the brand, it was just because it was in Barcelona when they came up with it, but the idea of the Barcelona Principles, there's some really good metrics. The challenge is that measuring at some of the level of sophistication that could really show impact, it's expensive. And being able to get your organization or your clients to invest in deeper measurement it gets pricey. Delivers a lot of value, but gets pricey. Also, you can't look at measurement in a silo. The most effective way at measurement is you take a look at all of the different levers and all the different KPIs and triangulate it against other results across media buying, across advertising. I think the last point within that, it's interesting with impressions. I share the belief that impressions are very inflated, particularly when you see certain outlets, and we all know them, where their UVPM is 20 million impressions. It's like, how is that possible? So I think, or 100 million, or whatever it may be, given the outlet without naming any. I think that kind of how I look at it, just from a pragmatic standpoint, is, I think this touches on kind of where Marco was going with it, is it's a benchmark, it's a yardstick. So similar to in advertising, you have household reach. Like, you know that if you have a show that airs on a certain channel, you have the potential to reach X million viewers, but you know, how many of them are watching at that time? You don't know, you're not in their homes. In most instances. So I think it's similar, that it's flawed, but it gives some sort of a gauge. But I think that in general, there's a lot of room for improvement.
Joe, as a client, when people say it's a mix of art and science, does that turn you off? Because how many of you have used that term? Hey, it's art meets science. Any of you talk about that when talking about our impact?
All right, I think the term
Arts and crafts,
Arts and crafts.
biology.
the term arts and science wouldn't necessarily turn me off. What does turn me off, and what I think is a major issue for our industry, is when people say things that when people say things along the lines of, I went into this field because I'm bad at math. I mean, the reality is that there's a tremendous amount of room for improvement. We're beginning to get more sophisticated at measurement. We're beginning to become better gradually at leveraging data and analytics to inform strategy. And going back to the earlier point, if you get that seat at the table, and you're there sitting with CMOs and CFOs and CEOs and folks who live and die by the numbers, and you say, I'm not good at math, but I'll write a great press release, then you are completely reaffirming all of those negative perceptions of the industry. So
Right, but
never say I
my
hate
argument
math.
is to say math is important, the measurement, the numbers are important, but what's more important is the qualitative success of what we do. You can get 7 billion impressions
You have to
on
look
a
at both.
bad article, and it's meaningless.
See, and I think what you're all actually talking about in a lot of ways is that we all are passionate about the idea of brand building and getting any type of story in front of people who can never consume your product because they're in the wrong regional market, or if they're not in the market for purchasing something like that, then you're not going to ultimately serve your brand by telling your story to the wrong people. And that's kind of the point of that 8 billion or whatever. 1 billion of those people are repeats or off planet, so they're probably not going to be beneficial, right?
Yeah. And I, what you were saying, Lindsay, about the quality play, I think that's where our future is at. I mean, we
I agree.
had an amazing, is this off the record or on the record? We got some good
Can
news.
we all go off the record?
Right, let's all off the record on this. We got some good news
We're going to need a social media blackout. We're going off the record.
Got some good news from South by on some applications that we wrote. And, that's the kind of thing, wow, that's the power of PR, right? That's the power of positioning and messaging and knowing the overall landscape of why this speaker and why this theme is going to resonate. Or another area that I think is a quality play that more of us should remember, and it's not necessarily connected to social, although it spreads through social, is really cracking the op-ed pages. I mean, we see that in political campaigns, but that's also a test whether a CEO and a CMO really has a sharp POV on not just talking about themselves and sell, but can we expand beyond it, right?
So I just want to ask you guys, actually building on that, one last question, but expanding beyond everything that we've talked about now, and I wish we had another half an hour, but you guys need coffee and I do too. So if we were going to think about what's something that people you feel get wrong with respect to brand building using traditional communications, what's something that you would just leave people to make sure to avoid this or make sure to avoid that?
I think people go too wide or too narrow. There's a sweet spot with flexibility for your brand that allows for storytelling. Again, it's that umbrella of control. Within that amount of control, you have to allow for flexibility, for risk-taking. I also think when it comes to brand building, sometimes it becomes an exercise in developing a commercial or a campaign. A campaign is not your brand. It's one story you're telling maybe one quarter. So it's really the essence, I think you said earlier, of who you are. It's the soul of the company. And finally, I think it's very difficult to weigh the difference between internal company culture, corporate culture, and the brand, which I believe is what the consumer thinks and the emotional journey you're taking. If you're lucky, the journey you're taking the consumer on. So it's important to go into the conversation knowing that we're going to bifurcate those topics and focus really on what the consumer thinks about your product and your company.
Yeah, I'll answer to reinforce Lindsay's point because I think it's so important. A major mistake is that people overlook their internal audiences. And in an environment where you have Glassdoor and Twitter and places where your employees have such a loud voice, if what you're saying externally from a brand standpoint doesn't match internally your behavior, eventually, more likely than not, it's going to catch up with you. What I think another, I'm cheating because I'm like doing kind of like a build on her and doing mine. I think another error that people make more from a process standpoint is that they look at brand building in silos. The earlier you bring in communications professionals, the better. It gives you a more diverse view of the brand building process. Also, I believe it results in higher quality work. So if you work in-house and you have an opportunity to bring in, have all the different functional leads around the table and functional representatives, I believe it will result in a better process. And then within that, set very clear boundaries so you could avoid turf wars. I think that that part of the process, especially in an environment where the lines are so blurred now, there's a lot of ways to really maximize that process and have incredible results, or either not handle it right out of the gate, or have there be blurry lines within blurry lines that could result in a lot of infighting and system failures.
Good stuff. I'd make two last points, one kind of niche-y on the name game. Names matter. Would you rather take Get Taxi or an Uber? Would you rather drive a Tesla or a Leaf? There's a reason why, certain names are perceived to be cool, like Casper, and others are sleepy or sleepies. I mean, it gets back to just Lenny Bruce-like, I don't know if you guys remember from the 1960s, of like, rye bread is cool, white bread is not. We have to be sensitive to that, and I think PR people have an ability to have EQ. The other thing is making sure that comms people look at copy that the brand specialists have gone over and written, because oftentimes, and I think, Lindsay, you made this point about advertising, that it can have a real different tone and a real different vibe that doesn't feel like it was written on planet Earth. And one of the things that we provide as PR practitioners is we are a bridge to reality, and we're a bridge to keeping it true, and we have to honor that. So, wrap up thoughts.
And on that note, thank you guys so much. This was a really great chat. We appreciate it.